I'm Marco Werman, and this is The World, a co-production of the BBC World Service, PRI, and WGBH Boston. 2011 is being called the Year of the Protester after events around the Arab world. But many periods in the United States saw a rash of protests as well, for civil rights and against the Vietnam War, for example. Well, 40 years ago this month, a group of protesters claimed victory after the country of Bangladesh broke away from Pakistan. Then President Richard Nixon supported Pakistan during the War for Independence to prove the U.S. would stand by an ally. As reporter Sarah Richards explains, one group of Americans felt they needed to prove otherwise.
I was ready to risk my life there. I wanted to get in front of that ship.
78-year-old Richard Taylor is talking about the day in July 1971 when he and a group of protesters used canoes and kayaks to try and block the freighter Padma from reaching the port of Baltimore. The ship was coming from Canada, bound for Pakistan. It was said to be carrying military equipment and ammunition, presumably to aid the government in its war with what was then called East Pakistan. The U.S. had ordered an arms embargo on new shipments to Pakistan, but newspapers reported that Pakistani freighters still visited U.S. ports to load military equipment that had been purchased before the embargo. Richard Taylor's flotilla of 2 canoes, 3 kayaks, and a rubber raft left from here, Froning Park. The police and Coast Guard tried to stop it, but Taylor says the group was undaunted.
One of the key parts of this was that the U.S. government was sending military aid to the West Pakistani government that was doing the invasion. So that made it particularly poignant. It wasn't just a lot of people suffering thousands of miles away, but our government was helping the suffering to happen.
Timmy Aziz knew that suffering firsthand. He grew up in East Pakistan. He was 10 when the war broke out. He now teaches environmental design here in Baltimore.
It's really impressive how far they would have had to have gone. They would have been way in the middle of the water and completely in harm's way. This massive freighter and these tiny little canoes, which would easily get washed away in the wake of a ship that size.
40 years on, Bengalis are expressing a renewed interest in their country's independence movement. One of them is New Yorker Aris Yusuf. He finds the canoe blockade story so fascinating that he's making a documentary on it.
I wanted to see if I can make a film about the history of 1971 Bangladesh Independence War and what happened in the U.S. and be able to put it together from the people who participated at that time.
What happened that time in July 1971 was that the U.S. Coast Guard foiled Richard Taylor and his friends. The Padma made it into the harbor. It was eventually loaded and left. The following month, protesters expanded their actions to include any Pakistani ship trying to dock in the U.S., regardless of its cargo, and they enticed longshoremen at the port of Philadelphia to join the boycott.
The cause had a heart, had a deep heart, and there were tremendous atrocities that were going on.
Today, 64-year-old Elliot Gevis is a pediatrician, but back in 1971, he worked the docks in Philadelphia. He learned about the war in East Pakistan and the canoe protest from flyers and helped convince other longshoremen not to load ships. The first freighter affected was the Al Amati. Richard Taylor and other protesters again used canoes and kayaks to try and block the ship. When it ran the blockade, Gevis and other dock workers refused to unload it.
So not everybody was supportive of that, but then again, they did respect unions, and they did respect not crossing picket lines and things of that sort. But at the same time, they had to pay bills and feed families, so certainly that was a big consideration.
When the ship pushed off, no cargo had been loaded or unloaded. After 4 more months of intense protests and picketing in front of the White House, the U.S. government finally ended all arms exports to Pakistan, marking the end of one of the more unusual protest movements in America's history. Richard Taylor's wife, Phyllis.
We've been just humbled by people who are Bengalis saying, that we couldn't have done it without this movement here, not us necessarily, but a small group of committed people giving us hope that you could make a change.
East Pakistanis won the war after 9 months of fighting. They were awarded a state known as Bangladesh. For The World, I'm Sarah Richards, Baltimore.